Economics is a subject that you confront in your daily lives. Whether you know it or not, you spend a great deal of your time thinking about economic issues, changing prices, purchasing decisions, the job market, use of your time, concerns about environmental policy, and growth. Thus, it's important that you have a strong economic literacy, and this means being able to convey and interpret economic ideas in graphs, through math, data analysis, and writing. In this lecture, The Economist's Toolbox, we'll talk about the tools that economists use when analyzing the economy. By the end of the lecture, you ought to be able to define economics, list the tools economists use when studying the world, explain why economists use graphs, math, and data analyses, and understand the basic organization of economic research papers. In other words, the objective of this particular lecture is just to get a feel for what this class is about. So refresher, what is economics? You'll find that most introductory textbooks define economics as the study of the choices people make to attain their goals given their scarce or limited resources. But really, it's a lot more than that. Economists like to study the incentives that influence people's choices, the arrangements that coordinate them, and the aggregate outcomes of such decision making. But this is my favorite definition, and it's from a principles book called Economics by Stiglitz and Walsh. So economics is a social science that studies the social problem of choice from a scientific viewpoint. So economists adhere to a scientific method, which is just a method of procedure consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. We'll talk in greater detail about the economist as a scientist in the next lecture. So at its broadest level, economists are really just interested in the relationship between different variables. So for example, a macroeconomist, someone who studies the aggregate economy, may ask, what happens to the inflation rate if the Fed prints more money, or how does an increase in the national debt affect economic growth? So a macroeconomist is interested in these relationships between inflation rates and money, or the national debt and growth. A microeconomist may ask, what's the best payment structure to increase worker productivity, or how do minimum wage laws affect youth unemployment? So to a microeconomist, some of the variables they're interested in is payment structures and productivity, and wage laws and unemployment. So to answer and communicate about these sorts of questions in such a complex world that we live in, economists use a variety of tools. First, economists become skilled in explaining economic behavior through modeling. Modeling is using words, graphs, math, and empirical methods. Empirical methods are really just a combination of math and data. But they model to explain economic phenomena and to create hypotheses or predictions. Second, economists observe, collect, and analyze data. They use data to look at trends and come up with neat questions, and to test the validity of their hypotheses or predictions. And third, economists follow academic writing guidelines for effectively conveying their ideas to their peers, and even sometimes to policymakers and the general audience. So the point is that you need to have this basic literacy in graphs, equations, data, and research. And that's why you're here now. This class is designed to provide to you the tools of graphical analyses, mathematical modeling, data analyses, and writing. So why graphs? Why are graphs so important to economists? If you've ever taken an introductory course before or have even read the news, most of the time economics is portrayed in graph. So we can observe data and look for trends in a graph. And graphs provide a nice representation of theories, how different variables are related to one another. And now, why math? It's every student's worst nightmare. So most economics students are shocked and disappointed to learn that math is an integral part of economics. It's true, economics began as more of a philosophy, but over time math has been used to complement, not replace, but to complement the study. So mathematical economics isn't a distinct branch of economics like environmental or IO, but it's just a tool that we use when analyzing those social choices. When economists use math, they just simply replace letters and sentences with symbols and equations. And economists can draw on a vast pool of theorems that already exist to aid in their analyses. Now, there are four main reasons why we actually use math. Economists use math because it forces us to be explicit, precise, and concise at every single stage of our reasoning. Second, math is a language. It's rigorous, it's logical, and it's global. Third, it allows us to be more realistic when graphs limit us. So as an example, if you've seen the model of supply and demand, that model is just a model for one market. It's known as partial equilibrium, but we know that in the real world, thousands, hundreds of thousands of markets exist. So math lets us study that when graphs fail us. Fourth, math allows us to transform the story we want to tell about economic behavior into a testable model. So with equations and data, we can verify if our predictions make sense. And what about data analysis or empirics? Data analysis is a body of methods that help to describe facts, detect patterns, develop explanations, and test hypotheses. And mathematics and data analysis are often complementary. They're mutually reinforcing. So in other words, we express our ideas, theories, hypotheses in math terms, and then test these hypotheses against empirical data for validity. Further, empirical work needs economic theory as a guide in order to determine the most relevant and fruitful direction of work. And then finally, why write? So developing models and testing them is a formal way to ask questions and search for answers. But economists need to know how to effectively communicate their ideas to the masses. So at the end of the day, the goal is to diffuse this knowledge that we've created as economists to our expert colleagues, our peers, our policymakers, and to a general audience. And there are basically three types of economics research papers. There's theoretical, empirical, and then a combination of the two, theoretical and empirical. We'll briefly go through each one in turn. So often when you hear an economist talk about a theoretical research paper, what they're really talking about is a mathematical model. So theoretical research papers are often written when data is unreliable or impossible to obtain. So what the theorist does is make reasonable assumptions about relevant environment and the economic agents, the firms, the people involved. Portray the math and use it to predict what should, in theory, happen. We use theory because it helps us make broad generalizations about how people or other economic agents or variables act under different circumstances. And when you read a theoretical research paper, you'll normally see an introduction, a literature review, the model and results of the model, and a conclusion. The second type of paper is an empirical research paper. So remember that data analysis. And so this is a natural choice when relevant data is available. Empirical research papers posit an explanation using data analysis, so using econometrics or numerical simulations. And empirical research papers generally include an introduction, a literature review, information about the data and the empirical strategy, the actual data analysis, a conclusion, and of course references. And then the final paper, theoretical and empirical research papers. So they predict what the answer to the research question should be using theory or math, and then they collect data and use that to test whether their theoretical prediction holds true. And so when you read one of these sorts of economic research papers, it'll have the intro, lit review, it will have the theoretical model and predictions, the data analysis, and a conclusion. And so in summary, what have we learned from this brief lecture? We know that economists like to study the relationships between different variables, and they like to explain this relationship in a variety of ways. They use graphs, They use math, data analysis, and finally, their words.